A decade ago, as I started deepening myself into the universe of video games, I eventually came across the path that would lead me to the world of horror games. Venturing into it, it didn't take long until I stumbled upon the classics, the most popular horror game franchises in the genre at that point. Those were, of course, Resident Evil and Silent Hill. I'd soon find out that they belonged to a subgenre of horror games called survival horror, which the concept was, as the name says, the horror of survival. These games usually put the characters into scary and vulnerable situations, forcing them to face powerful and dangerous obstacles with few resources that guarantee their survival in a threatening and unforgiving environment. My first experience with survival horror was with Dino Crisis, and the game that made me get into horror was Amnesia: The Dark Descent, though the first two I mentioned were the main reason for deepening my interest in the genre. Searching for more information about them after quickly becoming an obsession of mine, I soon found discussions online where people would compare one to the other and see which was better. Those arguments never made much sense to me because even though Silent Hill and Resident Evil were mechanically similar in some aspects, they always felt like vastly different games. Both series have very identifiable characteristics, and though I couldn't properly define those at the time, I always saw Silent Hill as a psychological horror game, with a more sober approach to its characters, narrative, the heavy disturbing themes, and even the violence present in it, even though most of the elements that unfold its plot and visual aspects are very much surrealistic. Resident Evil, on the other hand, is always centered more towards a mix of action and horror rather than psychological, and though it happens in a reality closer to ours, it is the one that feels the most unrealistic. The Resident Evil games often have a great and creepy atmosphere, with stories that usually have simplistic narrative structures filled with recognizable tropes and conventions, even if those are mostly composed of over-the-top elements, with comically exaggerated violence and an absurd and wacky plot execution, which always conclude in frenetic and explosive fashion, not to mention the larger-than-life characters that star most of these games. With all of that said, I also noticed that the Resident Evil games had this whole aura. A pretty distinct vibe that I couldn't wrap my head around at the time. A very specific feeling, something I couldn't define, but that I realized was present not only on several similar survival horror games, but also in some of the horror stuff I'd find on the shelves of movie rental stores. Being a little bit more specific, I'm talking about those horror movies that were either old or direct-to-video crap that usually saw the cover and thought, this is either gonna be really fun to watch or it's gonna suck so bad I'm gonna regret wasting my money for life. Although, in my opinion, I always thought most of the movies I rented were good and had things about them that I genuinely enjoyed and interested me. But I admit that most had questionable quality, although some of them were indeed the worst of the worst crap one could watch. And of course, after becoming unhealthily obsessed about the matter, I finally found the word I was looking for to define those vibes I just mentioned, which maybe most of you are already screaming it at the screen in agony. B-movies. This whole time I wanted to say that these old survival horror games feel like playable B-movies. And with that answer came more questions, such as how can one tell that old survival horror games feel like B-movies? What characteristics does a B-movie have so those aspects become noticeable? And why does a B-movie feel like a B-movie? When searching for answers and more details about the definition of a B-movie, the pages that popped up used the term for different reasons and contexts. I can say up front that most of them didn't give me what I was looking for. I found some places that answered some aspects of those questions, but not entirely. The answers were given sporadically, explaining mostly single and separate aspects of this group of movies. So, I had to keep looking. Of course, a lot of places defined B-movies in a mostly derogatory manner, even if in a tender tone. In a way, those websites weren't completely wrong. Indeed, several B-movies are of very low quality, but in my opinion, those detractive attributions not only didn't fit some of the films being discussed, but they also reduced low-budget films, especially the ones from the horror genre, to something that wasn't worth of artistic merit or thoughtful discussion. Subsequently, to find answers, I decided that I had to delve a little bit deeper into the history of cinema and replay those games, leading me into a rabbit hole to discover the reasons why they feel the way they do. In specific, horror B-movies made between the late 60s and early 90s, and how that visual style was transported into the early survival horror games, mainly the Resident Evil games, and how it became such an identifiable trait of their personality and core definition. Well, let's start from the beginning. During the 1920s, a practice called double feature was popularized among movie theaters. Their purpose was to find a way to make audiences watch more movies amidst the Great Depression, by exhibiting two movies for the price of one. Big movie studios, seeing the potential in that, decided to sell their films to movie theaters with two kinds of movies based on their budget and overall quality: A movies and B movies. The A movies were the ones made with a higher budget, while the B movies were made with a lower budget and a much less time than their counterpart. B movies were considered to be the big studio's best financial gamble to get their money back from a theatrical run, but were also the biggest source of income from smaller independent studios. The exhibited B movies were often westerns, noir, science fiction, and horror films, and they quickly got into the tastes of the general audience during the peak of the double feature era and matinees, with people often going to see those films instead of the A movies, which surprised both studio executives and theater owners. Though that's not to say that at the time the public didn't enjoy more thoughtful and emotional stories from other genres. Due to their smaller budget and quicker production time, these movies presented technical limits and had an overall lower quality, getting to the point of reusing stock footage, sets, and costume designs for several different films, since most of the financial resources were being invested on the A movies. Because of that, studio executives had their attention mostly and exclusively focused on where most of their money was being expended. In other words, B-movies weren't as much supervised as their higher budget counterparts. Ironically though, resulting from that lack of supervision, filmmakers often found themselves with a fair amount of creative freedom in their hands, taking advantage of those limitations and lack of resources to focus on telling good stories or create something different and unique, allowing themselves to be more imaginative and experimental with storytelling, technicality, and visual effects. Some of those movies even pioneered filmmaking and screenwriting techniques you tend to see in modern productions, that were so impressive and revolutionary at the time that there were B films as visually and narratively compelling as the classy A movies. Then, the advent of television happened, and with that, the downfall of the double feature practice, mostly due to some legal actions against the biggest movie studios, which were making a lot of effort trying to monopolize the practice and eliminate competition. With that, studios turned their focus and money to higher budget productions made exclusively for theatrical releases, pushing away a lot of B-movies straight to TV. That may sound like a bad thing, and in some ways, it is. However, that opened a huge window of great possibilities for independent filmmakers and low-budget productions to grow and explore their story's creative potential through different lenses and circumstances. So, between the 60s and 80s, there were a lot of independent low-budget productions being realized. They were riskier, more audacious, provocative, and controversial, touching upon themes and approaching filmmaking in ways that not even the big-budget productions coming from the more prominent Hollywood studios dared to explore. Unfortunately, a big portion of those films wasn't considered qualified enough to be released in more prestigious movie theaters, where the big studios were still dominant. Because of that, most of the independent and low-budget features started getting released in less prestigious movie theaters, known as grindhouses. These helped to popularize a trend of low-budget movies called exploitation, which also influenced several films to this day, especially the horror ones. The history of grindhouses and the films released in them is complex and fascinating, and I definitely wanted to get deeper into it, but this has the potential and material for a whole new video. So I'll stick to the main subject, which I'm taking way too long to get through, so let's leave that one for the future. Anyway, the B-movie film we are discussing really stood out during this era. And after watching several films and delving into the details of their productions, I finally had a glimpse of what enabled me to understand where that distinct aura came from. The vast majority of them, as I said a million times already in this video, had some sort of visual distinction that generated these vibes. Something that can be noticed throughout the entire runtime as your eyes witness the movie unfold before them. It's a unique style that you can definitely identify through the way the scenes are shot, the positions and movements of the cameras, the practical and visual effects, the lighting, the storytelling, the script, the acting, the directing, and basically everything you see has a sort of invisible but paradoxically apparent texture and aesthetics that make all the difference. So I had to come up with words that came close to describe that visual style, that texture. And despite the words I'm gonna use now, I mean all of them as compliments. These movies, somehow, have always felt dirty, grungy, grimy, sweaty, and rustic, while also being campy, poopy, whimsical, and a lot of times unapologetically silly and over the top. I'll delve more into that later, but the key word I was trying to find was handcrafted. And what do I mean by handcrafted? I mean that the people involved in the production of these movies didn't let the low budget be an obstacle to tell a story. After all, when it comes to that, the filmmaker's imagination is their biggest limit. In most B-movies, you can definitely feel an earnest form of craftsmanship, the effort and dedication from the crew behind and in front of the camera, attempting their best to make these movies look and feel the most cinematic as they can possibly be. A love for the art being expressed on almost every frame of the project, a genuine attempt to deliver an experience that they want people to remember, no matter the quality of the end result. A palpable sense of sincerity and care for what's being made. That all being said, the productions from most of these films were hell, troubled with several technical mistakes and issues, people getting underpaid, going through stressful situations, becoming constantly mad at each other, putting everything, their time, their sanity, their financial stability, and even their careers at risk to make sure these movies were made. They were a bunch of inexperienced dumbasses making every penny of their low budget count, because most of them were artists who truly believed in these projects, devoted to the single objective of making them happen, no caring if what they were doing would be considered style over substance by many. At this point, the word B-movie starts becoming more than a simple definition for low-budget productions. It starts to acquire a much broader and more complex aspect. It develops a singular charm, an identity, and soon becomes an identifiable genre of its own, very much aware of its characteristic sets of narrative tropes and aesthetics that, in some cases, even moved beyond the low-budget barrier. And for that very reason, the term B-movie cannot be automatically applied to all low-budget productions. And that's because of the existence of another group of movies called indie films. Even if most B-movies were also made independently and with a small budget, these indie films reached a point where they likewise acquired an identity and became a completely unique narrative genre of its own. It wouldn't be fair to classify them in the same stage as the others. On that note, you have the B-movies in spirit. Movies that possess the same components that make B-movies so identifiable, but that are made with a much higher budget. You can definitely tell that the old B-movies were a big influence on them narratively and aesthetically, with some examples following the same tropes but with a new approach or subverting them to bring novelty to the genre they are in. The thing is, since a lot of people nowadays see the term B-movie in derogatory ways, a lot of filmmakers are more often than not held back by safe corporate decisions and by how the money is spent. Because of that, it's very common to see higher budget films clearly inspired by old B-movies acting more important than they actually are, as if they are embarrassed by their origins and influences, which is honestly a shame. Now, whether those are good or not, it depends and needs a whole other discussion. Now, before completely detailing how these influences were applied on the old survival horror games, I must dissect a quintessential part of what defines the whole B-movie field, and that's camp. And what do I mean by camp? So, remember when I said several times in this video that B-movies are seen in a derogatory manner, as if they are something made out of bad taste? So, that's basically one of the many definitions of camp. Something that in a highly artistic conception is considered of bad taste, but aesthetically pleasing precisely because of how self-aware and sincere it can be about its virtually artless but heavily stylized conception. It knows pretty damn well how artificial and indulgent its whole extravaganza, theatricality, and over-the-topness is, and that sincerity is what makes it so attractive and charming to so many people. A lot of B-movies don't take themselves extremely serious because they acknowledge that part of their nature. The good ones, however, mostly play it seriously enough so the audience takes seriously the story that is being told, no matter the amount of self-awareness they see on screen. But sure, there are examples which don't take themselves seriously at all, though that can be a double-edged sword in some specific cases, with that omnipresent self-awareness running the risk of taking away that sincerity that makes these movies attractive in the first place. And of course, let's not forget the examples that don't have any awareness of its campiness whatsoever and take themselves way too seriously. Again, that's also a double-edged sword that can work in its favor exactly because of how straightforward they embrace their silliness or be hilariously bad because of it. It all depends on the execution in the end. Another element a lot of these movies share is a word that has a very close relationship with camp, and that is pulp, which by its own is an entire narrative and literary genre, but its influence was so large on B-movies that we could use it as a way to define the vibes these movies exhale. Pulp, speaking of it aesthetically, is mostly associated with the sensationalism approached in pulpy stories, which is very much in line with the eccentric theatricality of the camp present in them. The need to sensationalize and exaggerate the most dramatic and pivotal moments of the plot so it remains relevant and emotionally engaging is very noticeable, both in Pulp Fiction books and B-movies inspired by them in several aspects. It's a powerful combination that can either work very well for the sake of the narrative or completely backfire the most important moments of the story depending on the execution. I don't need to get into much detail on how that mostly turned out, right? Just see the bad popularity a lot of these stories got over the years. And now, with all of those doubts out of the way, with all the knowledge we got so far, we must do the $1 million question. What are the main elements the old survival horror games adopted from the B-movies, even being a completely different medium?
To make our correspondents around the country have been asking about that.
Well, let's start by acknowledging that video games are extremely capable forms of storytelling that can replicate, incorporate, and cause the same feelings and reactions as any other narrative medium. The story just needs to be well told and resonate with its audience in some way. In this case, players. And now for starters, we have a visual style in these games that very much resembles B-movies, of course horror ones, as well as the way their stories and plots are designed and structured. From all these early survival horror games, the Resident Evil franchise is the one that best captured and implemented those elements into their personality, and that's one of the main reasons these games are so popular. That's part of their whole appeal. But there are other notable examples that also managed to capture that B-movie feel we've been talking about until now. such as Alone in the Dark, Dino Crisis, Carrier, and Deep Fear. I may talk about them later, but my main focus will be on the first 3 Resident Evil games and Code Veronica. So, now that we are getting into more details, there's a very important aspect that old survival horror games have that is very much reminiscent and in line with the aesthetics and filmmaking decisions from B-movies, which is the choice of setting these games in enclosed environments. The plot can unfold in different parts of the world, but for most of it, they are set within restricted or isolated locations. That simplicity in the settings is a result of budgetary restraints, forcing filmmakers to be creative and find different ways to tell the story and make said restraints work to their benefit, coming up with new ideas on how to shoot a scene and interesting ways to engage characters into conflict in those spaces. That exploration of their limitations not only was often pretty effective, but also affected the tone and atmosphere of several films, especially horror ones. That's something that very much influenced Resident Evil to its core. By choosing to imprison the characters in these empty, confined, cramped spaces, it evokes an ever-present sense of isolation, unease, and claustrophobia, forcing players to think fast in unpleasant and desperate situations, which are intensified by the way the in-game cameras are strategically positioned in the scenery, depriving the players of clearly seeing the threats they are facing and where their attacks will come from. Some of the newer games, especially the remakes, had to reinvent the way they explored those elements to scare the players, but those principles still remain. Surely, it's fair to say that the only reason the first Resident Evil happens in an isolated mansion in the woods is because it was supposed to be a 3D remake of a NES game called Sweet Home, which the story also happens in an isolated mansion in the woods. But that's also because that game is a tie-in to a B-movie of the same name, which is set in the same environment and has the same story. Kinda. Just proving that these aspects were passed along by Resident Evil to the point of being pivotal in shaping its whole set of stylistic and narrative choices. Another thing they managed to implement with perfection in each game, not only in the environments and locations but also in the atmosphere, is that feeling I defined earlier with a set of keywords, such as dirty, grungy, grimy, sweaty, dry, and rustic. I think that was possible because these games and their characteristics were very influenced by how the budgetary restraints in B-movies forced practical but creative choices into their design. Each section and scenery feel very different from one another, even if they are mostly reminiscent of something you've seen being approached in other stories set in single locations. But most importantly, it's the way each of these places are explored in the plot that manages to make them so memorable and distinguishable as you go from level to level. Some examples are the locations that compose the Spencer Manor in Resident Evil, the intricate ways that lead out of the Raccoon Police Department in Resident Evil 2, the interconnected streets from Raccoon City in Resident Evil 3, and the several compartments of the Ibis Island in Dino Crisis. Each segment has several smaller sections within them that progress the plot, but are all contained in one single setting. Although you do a lot of things in these settings, consequently giving you the impression that you are going to several different places and witnessing a diverse range of plot beats as you proceed, the narrative structure surrounding all of that is, for most of the time, very simplistic. Even if the events that unfold said narrative, as well as some of the concepts and ideas that compose the whole story, are in contrast big and over the top. By that, I don't mean that the narrative doesn't have the possibility of being, in some way or another, complex and even thoughtful. Even if these games and movies, if similarly structured, manage to have a great story, scary atmosphere, settings, and visual style, a lot of them are more interested in entertaining, having fun with their over-the-top ideas, and exploring the genre that defines them, rather than deeply and thoughtfully exploring the established themes. That's not by any means a rule set in stone, but it's a tendency very common among these projects. Exploring cliches is not by itself a bad thing, but how that's all executed really matters. it can completely affect the tone and how the events of the plot are portrayed in the narrative, which directly influences how players, as well as audiences, perceive those elements within the whole thing. In other words, how serious they take what is being shown to them. The first Resident Evil is the game that best represents some of those components, and you can see that right at the very start. Not only because of the infamous live-action cinematic before the game begins, but also because of the intro before the menu. By itself, it already gives the player a glimpse of what's to come with the imagery. A dusty, dimly lit corridor as the camera dramatically zooms on the actor's face, who makes an even more dramatic scream as a fake torrent of blood spills on the screen and an overly serious soundtrack plays over it. All very campy and melodramatic. But of course, it's the cinematic that plays once you start the game that contains the most concrete proof of the vibes that are going to be carried on through not only the entire game, but also through most of the Resident Evil franchise. With this intro, the inspirations on old B-movies couldn't be clearer, especially because the intro is basically a horror B-movie short by itself. It starts with this moody narration, newspaper reels roll in the background. After that, you get the actors wearing pretty cheap-looking costumes, which makes it look like they came straight from a cosplay convention. But it gets better when the shot shows their hammy acting, the overly exaggerated violence, the silly puppet zombie dog that probably scared you as a kid, and the cherry on top, the cartoony introduction to each character. The most fun of it all? It plays it seriously, because it desperately wants you to take seriously what's to come, even if the result is laughable. As the games go, the campiness and how serious they take themselves starts to get more balanced. But here, in the first Resident Evil, they do all of that with a blatant straight face. While that's hilarious in its own way, the sincerity and apparent dedication to make something genuine and passionate out of it's what keeps you interested in what this game has to offer after the intro. Surely the awful dialogue and voice acting don't help a lot.
What is it?
It's a weapon. It's really powerful, especially against living things. Better take it with you.
But it compensates for all of that with a legitimately creepy atmosphere that wouldn't work at all if they didn't actually play things as seriously as they did. They wanted to make an impression on people and make something scary. And while we have the unavoidable B-movie goofiness in there, they really managed to do just that. An experience that left people scared and remained into their minds for the years to come. That honest dedication to making something authentic and inspired hits in the same vein as the artists who had very little money in their hands, who just wanted to make the best movie they could, even with their limitations. If it wasn't for that, the Resident Evil franchise wouldn't be where it is right now. That sincerity is the main reason for its success. The love for the tropes of the genre is clear and present in most creative decisions put into these games. In the visuals, the story, the small details, the enemies, its characters, and also on how it transits between the horror and action genres. Even the basic concepts that kickstarts most of the narratives are reminiscent of those tropes. With the simplistic but often effective, the characters enter a place and need to escape. Another thing they have in common is that their narrative structure always gets to a crescendo of things that culminate in an extreme sense of urgency that mostly ends with the characters blowing up the whole place, but not before facing a sort of ultimate threat, which is the amalgamation of the things faced through the game. What they face is either going to be one of the best or the most stupid looking things you probably saw in your life. And they are all in some way reminiscent of monster design tropes you've seen in several previous B-movies. For example, the Tyrant in Resident Evil, the final forms of Mr. X and William Birkin in Resident Evil 2, Nemesis Final Mutation in Resident Evil 3, Nosferatu and Alexia Ashford in Resident Evil Code Veronica, the T-Rex and Giganotosaurus in Dino Crisis 1 and 2, this Tyrant as Anthony Hopkins' plant-looking thing from Carrier, you get the point. These elements I discussed are only some of the several genre tropes that these games affectionately implement into their narratives and design. In most cases, while these games seem pretty self-aware of those inspirations, they manage to create a style and personality of their own, and that also extends to the creatures and characters that inhabit these worlds, reflecting in their design, their personalities, their dialogue, their actions, and how they react to the situation they are put in. In the majority of cases, the characters from these games and movies are larger than life, much like the events they find themselves in. They might, in essence, be like normal human beings, but they never act like so, as if they subconsciously know that they are characters in a script, saying script stuff and doing script things to move the plot forward. After all, most of these stories are not focused on them going through a personal journey to discover more about themselves. Of course, that's not to say there aren't moments in these narratives where the flow of the storyline slows down a bit to give these characters some sort of minimum characterization. This not only helps to distinguish them from the other characters around them so they don't blend with each other in a grey mess of people, but also, depending on the context, humanizes them at a certain level. But no matter how ordinary or normal, on very hard quotes, these characters are as people, they will always find themselves going through very extreme life and death situations that no normal, real human being would manage to survive or even put themselves in to begin with. Though the point is not so much on how these characters get into these situations, but on what they do to survive and get out of them. An occurring response to that question is to make the main characters be either trained cops and soldiers or, at the very least, experienced with weapons and survival skills. Still, the heights they reach to confront these dire situations are always impressive, to say the least. Especially when the characters don't fit into that category whatsoever and were just randomly thrown into the chaos. They might be normal human beings, but they are always blasting their way out of the circumstances with big guns, confronting dangerous, horrendous Erdrit creatures with everything they got, running away from collapsing buildings and jumping away from huge explosions, and then remaining physically and psychologically immaculate as if the insanity they faced is just a normal Sunday afternoon occurrence. However, there are cases where the characters are returning for a sequel, and that can serve as a way to show that they are either more prepared this time around, or that the events from the previous stories have affected them in some shape or form. Some notable examples of this are what happens to the characters from the Resident Evil games, which are the ones who went through the most significant and, on very hard quotes again, natural changes, going from what you define as a normal human being to complete superhumans. In the first games, you would see them going through some pretty insane shit, but they rarely did some over-the-top flips, dodged bullets, or punched boulders to survive. On the contrary, if they did a flip, it's because they were thrown to the ground. If they dodged bullets, it's because the shooter had stormtrooper aim. If they found a rolling boulder, they escaped from it, and other such things. It was grounded to some level that was enough to keep their humanity in check, which established a real sense of danger and despair when a very powerful enemy hit them right in the face. The only characters from the classic games that reappeared in subsequent games and kept that shade of humanity were Claire Redfield and Barry Burton. Jill Valentine started to lose that on Resident Evil 3, and that's shown right at the very start of the game. But even so, they managed to make her vulnerable in some ways, by giving her a formidable and seemingly unstoppable threat that follows her throughout the game in the form of Nemesis. Another good example from a different game is Regina from Dino Crisis. She's a Special Forces agent who is very well trained and capable of fighting and facing extreme situations. But she's still a human being, who is no match for the dinosaurs without a proper weapon and is constantly vulnerable to death when things go wrong. And that remains even on Dino Crisis 2, which is a much more action-focused game than the first and puts the characters in pretty insane situations. You can still feel that if things go terribly wrong, these characters could die in a blink of an eye, even if their arsenal is vast and more powerful against the dinosaurs that hunt them. That humanity is not limited to those aspects. It also expands to their personality and how they react to the absurd things they see, which compensates for their lack of complexity. For instance, it's common to see them having their actions, reactions, and motivations guided by idealistic thoughts or a strong sense of morality. but that's what mostly defines them through the entirety of the plot, and rarely they'll go through a change of character and make decisions that contradict their beliefs. That's why the vast majority of these characters are walking tropes you've seen being approached 1,000 times in the past. Dialogue is another defining trait from both B-movies and survival horror games that's usually pretty noticeable. In this case, it is defined by the fact that dialogue in most of them freaking sucks and no one talks like a normal human being. You often see them throwing cheesy one-liners, spitting out overlong expository dialogue, saying the most nonsensical and idiotic crap a human being could have written on a script, exchanging lines that have nothing to do with each other, or being way too extra on the delivery of moments that were supposed to be emotional or taken seriously, though that also has a lot to do with the acting. Those are things that, as bad as they sound, in this case, makes the experience even more fun than it was supposed to be. Fortunately, or unfortunately for some, the old survival horror games are filled from top to bottom with the most hilariously bad dialogue and amateur voice acting one could find. Yeah, some examples don't enter into that category for most of the parts, like in Dino Crisis. Now, you get games like Resident Evil and Deep Fear, and you get some pretty honest laughs out of most dialogue scenes. The first Resident Evil is infamous for that, with Barry Burton delivering some of the most iconic lines that were ever put into a video game.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right!
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you. Whoa! This hall is dangerous!
There's also that scene of a dying Richard, which is honestly freaking hilarious.
Oh, Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ow. There is serum. Oh no.
I should have brought some with me.
Wesker's silly monologues.
I think you misunderstand me, Jill. To me, the monsters you mention mean nothing. I'm going to burn all of them together.
That's the real pure definition of so bad is good. In subsequent games of the franchise, the voice acting and writing got better, but you still got some funny moments.
Tell me what I need to know. How can I save Sherry?
I have detailed information.
Now, Deep Fear comes really close to topping the first Resident Evil in that regard.
Chief!
What's going on?
April Fools! Did you forget it's April Fool's Day?
You know, we don't have time for these fun and games.
The only reason that it doesn't come to that is because some scenes and dialogues are there for an actual attempt to build character and add to the narrative. Too bad that it's badly written for the majority of the time, and there's this character called Dubois, which might be the most outrageous thing this game made, and you just can't take it seriously when he speaks.
Oh, there's no problem with my CFOX system. No accident should have occurred. Oh!
Another point I want to delve into is some of the most, if not the most, appealing parts of the old B-movies, as well as the games we are talking about, the threats the characters go up against. A lot of people go to these movies or play these games because they want to see the characters fighting monsters, weird scientific abominations, eldritch creatures from another dimension, or Asian alien creatures that are now awakened and causing havoc. It's the epitome of all the over-the-topness, campiness and silliness these games and movies could deliver, but also the main reason for their popularity. With B-movies, you'd get these either weird or awesome looking puppets that were the main selling point of these movies, and in a lot of cases they just appear towards the end. There are not a few instances in which the reveal is terribly underwhelming, with the puppet being all janky and feeling like it's about to fall apart and self-destruct at any moment. Even so, the experience of watching an entire movie only to see their silly creature at the end is always fun and interesting, even if the movie itself is crap. These creatures, such as their concepts and designs, are pure genre extravaganza, and it's pretty clear that these are some of the main aspects that inspired old survival horror games. For most of the time, the monsters in them look great and are peak B-movie goodness. They are inherently goofy and silly, no matter how good, scary and grotesque they look. A lot of them have way too elaborate designs and don't make a lot of anatomical sense, and that's the point, especially when you remember that they were made strictly under the rule of cool. In other words, they don't need to make scientific sense, they only need to look cool. They are not supposed to feel or be realistic, that's their whole appeal, what makes them so scary and conceptually interesting. From the world of video games, Resident Evil is well known for their great bestiary. Firstly, the games got famous for the zombies, which used to be the main selling point of the franchise, even if they were never the biggest threat the characters came up against. Besides them, they have some weird goopy monsters and scientific aberrations full of teeth, tentacles, multiple limbs and eyes, as well as humanoid mutants that are hilariously tall and have their weak spots exposed so the world can see, making you question why someone would approve them as powerful biological superweapons in the first place. You also get highly aggressive giant mutated animals, such as the giant alligator loose in the sewers, which is a walking, living, breathing trope of its own. But who the hell cares? It's stupid and silly, and that's why it's so fun to begin with. Otherwise you wouldn't get the giant snakes and spiders to mess up with people's phobias. On that note, there are the dinosaurs from Dino Crisis, which constantly act like bloody, thirsty killers who do everything in their reach to get a piece of you. Like, you get a T-Rex breaking windows, destroying helicopters, and even getting an elevator for a quick snack. If that's not enough, in Dino Crisis 2 we get a literal army of velociraptors uniting to destroy a whole town. The T-Rex getting shot by a tank and brushing it off as if it's nothing, a kaiju-sized Giganotosaurus that survives a freaking missile explosion and the only way to kill it is with a satellite laser. So yeah, you get what I mean? These monsters and creatures are an essential part of these games and movies, of how they explore the genres they delve into, as well as the core defining factors of their identities. That and all of the other elements we discussed so far make a clear map we can trace down to why these movies have such distinct feeling from the other kinds of movies and how these early 90s survival horror games managed to capture those vibes with perfection. With all that has been said so far, we can conclude that B-movies built their whole identity and managed to create its own movie genre, one that is so distinguishable from the others by not only exploring recognizable genre tropes in unique but somehow comfortably familiar ways, but also by defining stories that came from a very personal place to those who made them. A place of admiration for the craft of filmmaking, a necessity from artists to create something they love from the pure will of making a movie no matter how low the resources are. The end results might not have been the greatest, but what makes B-movies so appealing is their sincerity and high sense of style. They need to be something genuine and entertaining to the people who watch them. That's what makes them feel so unique and special. The horror genre is the one B-movies most relied on and built most of their character from. Horror is very well known for not only being one of the most versatile genres to exist, but also for being able to exist in movies made with the lowest amount of resources one could have. And it's mostly because of it that these movies, as well as the several filmmakers who made them, were able to achieve a higher status in people's minds, in culture, as well as in the harsh world of filmmaking. It's a fact that these artists inspired and keep inspiring several generations of storytellers, who in the future will make movies and video games. It's curious that even if video games are created in a totally different manner, the survival horror genre managed to capture with almost sheer perfection the singular aura from these movies, which also resulted in them creating an identity of their own and inspiring future game developers and filmmakers alike. Much like the B-movies that motivated their existence, the old survival horror games are really important, not only for the history of their medium, but also for the horror genre. And that's it! I hope you guys enjoyed this. Don't forget to comment what you think, leave a like, and subscribe to see more. See you guys in the future. Bye!